Hello, and welcome to another Bristlecone Broadcast. I'm Michael Lean, and today I have Ramesh Doreraj, who is our practice head for management consulting and procurement excellence. Ramesh has over 25 years of experience and has worked with over 40 Fortune 2000 companies, GM, Sotheby's, Cushman Wakefield, just to name a few. This man has seen everything and knows what to do for you in procurement to be successful. Now, things have changed drastically over the past couple years. What worked pre-COVID is not necessarily working post-COVID. We have a recession that's looming over everything. We have rising inflation, which may have stabilized or may go up, may go down. We don't really know. And we also have the fact that while it is a recession and companies seem to be laying people off, they're also hiring people. They're still buying. There's an intense amount of demand for supply. It's kind of a crazy time. And if anybody says they have things figured out, I would question that. So today we're going to talk about three topics to ensure procurement success. We're going to talk about cost optimization, cost takeaway. We're going to talk about ensuring the supply, the security of the supply. And we're also going to talk about digitizing and automating where possible. If you follow these three steps, you should have success. But how you approach them, how you do them is highly nuanced and not necessarily what you would have done pre-COVID. So Ramesh, I set the stage. It's a crazy time. High inflation. It's kind of a recession.
Yep.
How do people deal with that? Let's talk about cost optimization. This seems to be table stakes. To me, this is something that people have been doing forever. Why is it different now? And if it's different, what's different about it and how should people approach it?
I think what's changed since the pandemic hit is there's a certain realization by companies that they need to think ahead and act on real-time data. And I think there's a big demand for that, especially in terms of, hey, if certain products are going to get stuck somewhere because of a logistical, strike or lack of shipping capacity, then how do they plan around that? Do they have enough inventory on hand to plan for those downtimes? I think those are some of the key areas which are coming up more and more now in terms of cost reduction. Now, at the same time, also buying these products and these raw materials at a price that is viable enough for companies to still continue to turn a profit.
Okay, so what are the strategies that they could do? Can you give us a few things that procurement leaders should be doing?
I think in terms of what procurement leaders, especially in the manufacturing space, are working on is, I think there's a saying about, hold your business associates really close to you, right? So in the case of suppliers, I think gone are the days when companies are just kind of going to suppliers and beating them up for lower prices and calling that a cost saved. Right now, the focus is more around actually ensuring that you have a good established relationship, at least with some of your critical suppliers, understanding their pain and helping them through that pain. If some of these suppliers are facing certain material shortfalls that are coming from their suppliers and they're unable to meet your necessary need, due to a legitimate reason, companies are looking to work with the suppliers to ensure that they can kind of smooth through that rough time. So building longer term relationships with your critical suppliers to ensure that you have a constant supply of your raw materials is a key strategy that many companies are kind of taking into account.
So with that strategy, it sounds like a lot of soft skills, very qualitative. How would you put rigor or process around that?
I think to put the rigor or process around it, you do have age-old contracts, right? And I think a lot of times when I look at contracts at companies where I've gone and advised CPOs, I see the same things covered in the contracts, pricing, payment terms, what would you do when an emergency happens. But what the contracts don't address is how you are going to work with your supplier to make this a mutually beneficial relationship, and where there's going to be like the trust between the two parties and sharing of information. And many companies are actually putting that to paper and actually signing it between both parties so that it's something for them to meet over during quarterly business reviews. Now, you don't necessarily need to do this with all your suppliers, but at least with some of the core ones that provide you the raw materials to build your final product.
So this is fascinating. Can you give me a concrete example of what that would be inserted in the contract?
Sure. So let me give you an example from about 7, 8 years ago when I did some work, and I forgot to mention the name of this client. You must have heard of Schwinn bicycles.
I have a
You know,
Schwinn.
yeah, and they also
I wrote a
manufacture.
Schwinn in an Ironman that I did, and I love
That's
that
awesome. And
company.
I figured
Yeah.
that you, of all people, Michael, would know what Schwinn is, right? So I did some work at Schwinn, and a lot of people don't realize that, but most people think of China as a manufacturing giant. But for bicycles, Taiwan is ground zero for bicycle manufacturing. So I traveled to Taiwan to actually negotiate contract with several of the bicycle manufacturers there for on behalf of Schwinn, and essentially it was to let them know that, hey, listen, here's our production plan that's coming down the pike. Here are the prices that we really want to charge our customers. In other words, the price that you're going to pay when you go to Walmart or
Mhm.
a bike shop to buy it. Therefore, what can you do in order for us to hit these prices to keep your manufacturing costs so that you can also turn a profit and we're able to meet those costs? So it was actually a very open sharing of our intended price and what their costs were going to be. And we actually put down some of that information on paper and signed them saying, hey, listen, if you're able to maintain your costs here and we're able to actually meet our revenue targets, then we will give you a certain portion of that as savings. The same way, if you're able to lower your manufacturing costs, maybe because the price of steel goes down, then you will also give us back some of that money from and that was basically from a
Huh.
money standpoint, right? But then there's also like systems data and other information that we wanted to share. So that's an example of somewhere where we put this together, and I know this is pre-COVID, but that is taking a much more of an important role, putting together these kind of agreements where you share information and be in it for each other's better.
That's incredible. Yeah, and Schwinn makes a great bike. Okay, so those are a few examples of cost takeaway, cost optimization, what you can do in a practical sense.
Yeah.
What about the security of supply? What does that mean, and what can companies do about it, and what has changed pre-post COVID?
Right. I believe, see, security supply is several things, right? So one is to make sure that you get your goods in a timely manner so that you're secure and you're able to meet your manufacturing targets. And then the second bigger question is, to make sure that you're actually going to be able to get that. I mean, is your supplier even capable of giving you that, right? So suppliers could have the capability of doing that one year, but then because of economic factors, market conditions, they could be in a bind next year. So security of supply essentially means two things. One, definitely keep your critical suppliers closer. Okay. Second, there's nothing wrong in also hunting and finding additional sources that are secondary suppliers. I mean, you don't need to promise a certain volume of business to these secondary sources, but make sure that your supply base and make sure you can go to these people and pre-vet and pre-qualify some of these suppliers. I mean, you're not going to just be able to go buy, I don't know, 1040 steel from some guy that you just Google search, because you need to make sure that the quality is right. So make sure you pre-qualify these additional suppliers and let them know that you will reach out to them when there's a need. So ensuring that you kind of sow your wild oats a little bit further so that you have additional sources is the best strategy for security of supply.
Now, when you go into a client and you look at their supplier base, do we have any methodology that we follow that says, okay, for this supply, you meet XYZ, so this is safe, but this is in the red? How do you approach that?
I believe there are different strategies that companies can use in order to determine, okay, hey, how do I do security of supply with this versus that, right? So usually there's an ABC classification that happens, based on the amount of spend you have with the supplier. But I think what's more important is you need to understand if this is just a one-time spend that I've had with a particular vendor. Microsoft may show up as like a large supplier that sits on top up there, but that may be because you probably bought a bunch of servers from them last year. But is there like items that you're constantly buying, over several years? Those are the critical vendors you need to be looking at, and that falls above a certain threshold of spend. And depending on whether it's a commoditized item or not, and usually, I mean, the way I'm discussing it usually tends to be a commoditized item. A perfect example is, if you look at Tesla and some of the electric vehicles, they they need lithium, and the price of lithium went up like 5-6 times last year. Early 2021 through late 20. I think it is going down right now, but that is a core component for EV. So that really put a dent on EV manufacturers. So there may not be additional sources of lithium, right? So you may need to, probably just communicate to your customers in advance, letting them know that price increases might be happening due to these raw materials. However, how do you know that? You need to be able to forecast that. And in order to forecast, you need to be able to follow markets. I'm really surprised when I look at commoditized contracts, and I'll just mention this one last point, right, Michael, on this topic. When you see a lot of commoditized contracts, they don't have it tied to a leading material index in the world, and therefore the vendors kind of given free rein to charge what they want. But at least if you knew where that index was, you'd be able to go back and question your vendor.
Got it. So it sounds like with the security of supply, it incorporates forecasting, planning, evaluating the relationships that you have, coming up with redundancies. I imagine we have a matrix when we go into these companies where we literally go through and make sure that everything is covered. And would you say that when everything is covered, that's when you can say that you have a good grasp on security? Is that correct?
Yeah, that would probably be a true statement. And another area that I have advised companies to do is, hey, pick some of your critical suppliers. I'm sure you have your own criteria. Pick them and then do a continual risk assessment on them on an annual basis. Just like you may check your weight and your muscle gain on an annual basis, right? You just want to make sure that you do a risk assessment of your critical suppliers on an annual basis, just to make sure, hey, are they too big to fail? Yeah. Okay, because of whatever might be happening, right? And if that's the case, do I have adequate additional sources, or am I doing everything possible to help them stay afloat? Because if that fails, then I fail, right? So you can't be in a situation where the one supplier kind of takes you down. So ensure that you have additional suppliers, but also do everything proactively to keep that supplier afloat.
Yeah, you said, like monitoring weight. It's the holidays, Ramesh. We're not monitoring weight, right?
I stopped monitoring my weight 20 years ago, Michael. So I like to talk about that, but
my shirt still fits, so I'm feeling good.
It does.
Okay, so this leads to our last point, automating where possible, doing a complete digital transformation of the supply chain. This seems like an extremely heavy lift. I imagine when we go in with a client, there's some quick wins that we can do, but what's the approach? What is different post-COVID? This was going on a few years ago.
I believe what's different post-COVID, Michael, is this. I think before COVID, there was just a focus on cost reduction, and which literally fell on, hey, can we drive unit prices down and buy at a better price? But I think post-COVID, there's also realization that beyond just hard cost savings, which may not necessarily exist because of things like inflation and the economic slowdown, what else can we do internally to make our operation more efficient? And I think the way to do that is through digitization. Digitization and just reducing the time to complete certain processes, okay? For example, we recently sold a job at one of our clients last year, but it was a manual kind of contract sign process. I mean, we have something called DocuSign these days. That's just a very simple example of automating something, right? But this was actually still a manual process. I think the client had DocuSign. We could have got it done in a day, but it took about a week to get that done. But that's just a very simple example. If you look at procurement, right, the main thing that a lot of companies are addressing is how do I go from developing a requisition to actually getting that approved to a PO and then broadcasting it to a supplier and then covering the invoice process. Imagine if there was no automation there and everything was just paper-based. Can you imagine the number of invoices you would get every month, right? And you'd be surprised, Michael, there's still a lot of large companies, Fortune 100, Fortune 200, that still do paper invoices and checks. So automating that procure-to-pay process remains one of the largest areas where companies tend to focus on in terms of automation. Another automation piece is just availability of data, being able to pull all your procurement spend and to be able to get intelligent insights from it so that you can act on it.
Yeah.
If I need to go get 10 Excel files and then put together my own kind of table to get procurements, and that's going to take me a month, right? But if I had real-time access to it, like, I don't know, Power BI, that there's so many different spend tools out there, right? You can just kind of go download the information and take a look at that, and that gives you immediate actionable intelligence.
And it's not just procurement. We're seeing that across the board.
I think it's across the board. Yep, you're right, Michael. So that's another area that they're focusing on. And just, I think a lot of CPOs have asked me these days hey, if you were to give me like a scorecard that I could carry around every day and I could see the numbers changing in it, and that kind of tells me where I am as an organization. In reality, basically, what is that? It's a dashboard. It's a dashboard, control tower, you name it, right? But what are the metrics that you want to be tracking? So there's also a big focus on actually establishing metrics for procurement organizations and then trying to say, okay, hey, how am I doing as an organization addressing that?
I like that. It seems like we very much, we go in, we learn about the organization. There's best practices to follow, and we're platform agnostic. So we take what's important for the business, and then we apply the tools that we think may help. Tools won't solve it on its own. If you go tool first, we all know it fails. Yep. So I do like what you're talking about.
Well, one more thing I'll mention, Michael, that I haven't brought up, and I know it wasn't the 3 points. There's also quite the recognition.
Okay. Give the
quite the recognition by companies that they also need to focus on supplier diversity as well as adhere to ESG. Okay, ESG is like a big topic in a lot of companies. Hey, am I buying materials from suppliers where is it coming from like legitimate sources and not like I don't know, like blood diamonds is an example, right? Or coming from war zones, child labor involved. Many of the data that you're looking for ESG may not necessarily exist, especially if it's coming from like the developing world. But there's another big focus on that. And I think over the next 10 years, that's going to become part and parcel of developing overall procurement strategy for most companies.
Totally. So it wasn't just 3 points. It was the 3 plus a bonus success criteria for amazing procurement. That's great.
Absolutely.
Ramesh, this was wonderful. Thank you for this. As always, Ramesh is available for a conversation if you would like. Just get in touch with us. But until then, this is Michael with another Bristlecone broadcast. Thanks for tuning in.